click. Okay, we're recording now.
Hi
Go ahead,
all.
Manu.
Yes, hi all. This is Manoj, and I am the host of the Current Thing podcast. We have Kalza as our first guest, who hosts his own Silk and Steel podcast. We are a podcast that primarily deals with international relations, diplomacy, geoeconomics, culture, and history. And today we want to start off our podcast series by talking about Sino European relationships and diplomacy from the time of Opium Wars to the current day Ukraine crisis. Yes, we have a very ambitious timeline ahead of us, but hopefully Carl can take us through in a very quick manner on how he sees this very important diplomatic axis evolve.
I'll try to condense 180 years the time frame here. Okay, so we're basically talking about the modern era Euro China engagement. So the one thing that happened was during the so-called Great Age of Discovery, Portuguese circumnavigated Africa. They broke through the Indian Ocean trade system. There has been a long existing Indian ocean trade system among Indians, Arabs, Malays, and Chinese that has been carrying on forwards for thousands of years. But when the Portuguese came, they tried to muscle in using their superior military power. The Portuguese have sturdier ships because the European, they built their ships for sailing in the Atlantic, which is very stormy. So they have to build their ships very sturdy to withstand the waves. But whereas the Indian Ocean is comparatively calm, and traditionally the trade is conducted by the monsoon season, because the monsoon wind or the trade wind blows one way half the year and then switch direction the other half of the year. So in terms of naval technology, the Europeans had advantage. Their ships are bigger, more sturdier, have more cannons, and so the Portuguese were very quickly able to establish a maritime hegemony, and they established a series of forts in on the coast of Asia, and they also, this is where another European invention helped is the Star Fortress or the Bastion forts that was developed during the Renaissance Italy, during the Italian wars. So they built the Star Forts or the Bastion forts. They have these protrusions coming out of it. So there's no dead zones. Every angle can be covered by shooting from the wall. So there's, for somebody to approach those European Renaissance, Italian Renaissance forts, if you don't know how to take them, it's very, very difficult to overpower those forts. So with this military technology advantage, the Portuguese established a series of trading outposts. They're not strong enough to actually move inland to subjugate traditional Asian empires, but they were able to hold on to their little enclave of fortresses on the coast supplied by their ships. And then follow Portuguese footsteps, the Spanish came. The Spanish came to the Philippines. They set up, they quickly realized, most of the European, they came to East Asia they came to Asia for two reasons: spice, right, which is produced in southern India and also modern day Indonesia in the Spice Islands, and then to access Chinese goods like silk, porcelain, and later tea. And when the Spanish came to the Philippines, they realized the Chinese merchants already present in the Philippines, and then they tried to the capture Spanish capture Manila, and they try to set up Manila as an entry port where the Chinese traders will come to trade Chinese goods for the American silver the Spanish were mining in the Americas. And then came the Dutch. That Dutch is a latecomer because they had to gain their win the War of Independence against the Spanish Empire, but very quickly they were over. Dutch have even better ships than the Portuguese, so they were very quickly booting out the Portuguese from places from from Sri Lanka all the way to Straits of Malacca. The Dutch pretty soon established their base on the island of Java. They built their own city, Batavia, which would become Jakarta, and the Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, they all wanted to trade with China, like that, because back then China was world's largest economy, and that has been the golden. That was a golden destination since the time of Marco Polo's. Columbus read Travels of Marco Polo's, and he wanted to sail west, to China and circumnavigate the globe in order to find a different route to China. And so the goal has always been to trade with China, but the problem is getting there, and once getting there, establish their presence. So when the Portuguese first came to China, they tried to do what they have always been doing, which is muscle their way in, selling their gunboats, selling their ship there, and blast away, and then take a piece of land where they can build their fortress. But they were defeated by the Ming Navy. And so in the end, they decided to resort to bribery. The Portuguese bribe a local governor in Guangzhou, basically allowing them to lease a piece of land in the place became known as Macau. And that became the first kind of the European enclave on mainland China to do trade with China. And then Portuguese, they found so there's not much Portuguese trading items they could trade with China, but Portuguese found their niche because at the time, the trade between China and Japan was prohibited. This was because of the Japanese piracy problem during the late Ming. So the Ming court prohibited the Japanese ships from coming to the Chinese ports. But there was still a great demand in China for Japanese silver. And in Japan, there was a great demand for the Chinese silk. So what happened is Portuguese became a middleman, because Portuguese, they also got granted trading rights in Japan. So while Japanese ships cannot sail to the Chinese port, Portuguese can both land in China and in Japan. So they're doing their East Asian network was sustained by this triangle trade between, actually bilateral trade between Japan and China, with Portuguese serving as middleman. Because at the time, China has great demand for silver, and silver was discovered in Japan around the same time. So Portuguese found their niche, and then came the Spanish. The Spanish first, they also tried to get their own piece of enclave on mainland China. Again, they were denied. So they settled on the Philippines. They said the next best thing at the time, Spanish actually had an ambitious plan to conquer China because their experience in the Americas where they conquered the Aztec and the Inca empires. So they were overconfident that they could conquer China with a couple thousand Spaniards. But that plan, of course, never was put into practice because they had some other problem to deal with, the least of which is a Dutch revolt. So Spanish set up shop in Manila. They will welcome the Chinese traders to cross the ocean, to cross South China Sea, to come to Manila, bring the Chinese goods, where they will trade the Chinese goods for American silvers that the Spanish were mining in Americas. That's one that the mining of silver is what actually made the Spanish colonization in Americas profitable, because that's what they were looking for, actually, gold and silver. And they discovered huge silver mine in Bolivia, in Mexico, and every year they have these kinds what's called the Manila galleon trade. So they have big Spanish galleon ships loading up with American silver at the port of Acapulco, Mexico, and sail across Pacific to Manila, and where they will unload the silver, and the silver will be used to trade with the Chinese merchants coming to Manila for the Chinese goods like tea, silk, porcelain. And then the Dutch, Dutch, they're a bit far. They're way back in, like the Dutch East Indies, which is present day Indonesia. So they, what they did then, they also couldn't carve out their own colony in China. So they tried to do because Dutch were defeated. Dutch also tried what the Portuguese initially do, which is militarily, come in and take over a Chinese port, demanding the right to trade. They were denied. The Dutch were defeated again by the Ming Navy. So they did what they thought the next best thing. They took over the island of Taiwan. The Dutch then colonized Taiwan for I think almost 40 years or 20 years. It depends on how you define when the colonization begins. And Taiwan became actually one of the most profitable Dutch colony in East Asia. So they would, what they did is originally they said they wanted to use Taiwan as a kind of launching point to trade with mainland China. But eventually, they realized the most profitable way to keep Taiwan is to farm the Chinese, and so they would encourage. So back when the Dutch first arrived, there were about a couple thousand Han Chinese living on Taiwan, either as fishermen or pirates. But most of the island was populated by indigenous people of Taiwan. And so Dutch set to subjugate indigenous tribes, but they find out that they find out it was far more profitable to import Chinese indentured servants as contract laborers to come to Taiwan to work in sugar plantations. And that's when during the Dutch colonial rule, Dutch actually encouraged a mass migration of Han Chinese from the province just across the Taiwan Strait from Fujian into Taiwan. And at that time, during the late Ming, was a time of turmoil in China. There was a civil war, peasant rebellion. So a lot of people are looking to leave, and many people did make the trip to Taiwan. And the Dutch ruled Taiwan for decades until they were finally kicked out by the Ming loyalist general Koxinga, aka Zheng Chenggong, in 1661, right? So 16th and 17th century, that's also when the European missionaries come to China. The Jesuits first wanted to had their mission to come to China in the 1580s. And their first mission didn't succeed because the missionary died on an offshore island of China, didn't even reach mainland. But eventually they made it to, in the late 1500s, the Jesuits made their way to mainland China. They ingratiated themselves with the Chinese court, the imperial court. At that time, they realized, okay, maybe because proselytizing is still illegal, in much of China. So they felt, okay, we'll just work on the Chinese elite. If we convert the Chinese emperor, then we can convert the whole empire. And so they actually, some of them received Mandarin posts in the Ming court, and they actually had a couple of successful converts among the Ming Mandarins in Beijing. And they brought, that's when they started to did a lot of translation. At the time, the European knowledge of the world. For example, they made a world map. The Jesuit made a world map and presented to the Ming court, translated into Chinese. A lot of the translation terms kind of stayed in the Chinese language, like the name for Africa, for Europe, for example. And the Jesuits were able to assert their influence in the Chinese court for for many decades, even after the fall of Ming, even when the Manchus crossed the Great Wall and established Qing dynasty, they still had the Jesuits still had influence over the during the first couple during the reign of the first couple of emperors, because they bring scientific knowledge and knowledge of astronomy and medicine that was that so the emperors found them useful, found this new Western knowledge useful, so they were kept around. And meanwhile, on the ground, we have the Europeans coming from via sea. We already talked about Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, but there's also from overland, because the Russians were expanding eastwards through Siberia ever since the collapse of so after during the Mongol Empire, the Muscovy Princeton of Muscovy became powerful as a tax collector for the Mongol Khan. And when the Golden Horde collapsed, Muscovy was powerful enough to expand throughout the former Russian realms, and then to annex other former parts of Golden Horde's territory. So they started to push through east through Siberia, and very quickly by 1600s they already reached the Pacific Ocean, and in the 1640s the Russian reached the Amur River Valley, and then they came into conflict with the Qing Empire, because the Qing Empire had just conquered the Amur River Valley like few years before the Russian came. But then the Manchus got distracted, because in 1644 Manchu breached the Great Wall, and they all moved in force south of the Great Wall to conquer the rest of China. So they didn't leave much military behind in Manchuria, definitely not in northern Manchuria. So Russian Cossacks took that opportunity to infiltrate the Amur River Valley. And by the time their presence was finally noticed by the Qing sent a couple of expeditions to kick the Russian out. And that Sino-Russian conflict continued for many decades until 1689. 1689, the signing of Treaty of Narchinsk. It's the first Sino-Russian treaty, but it's also the first China-European treaty, which both sides signed as equals, right? Which is kind of unprecedented, because normally the Chinese emperor, they demand the others to treat him as a sovereign, as as at the higher hierarchy, but they made an exception for the Russians. Because I think partly because the Qing recognized the Russian military power, and the Qing was also at the moment was busy subjugating the Mongols. They were busy, particularly the Zhuanggar Mongols who had occupied outer Mongolia. So the Qing didn't want the Russian to interfere in the war against the Mongols. They didn't want the Russian to help the Mongols. So they come to an understanding to give up the border and set the boundary at the tributary of Amur River. The Argun River became the border between China and Russia in 1689. And then after that, Russian caravans start to come, trade caravans start to come through overland route through Mongolia to trade with China. After Qing pacified Mongolia, they set up a border town on the Russia-Mongolian border, where the Russian merchants will come and trade with the Chinese merchants. This meeting will end in 10 minutes. Oh my God, there's a time limit on the freaking free version of Zoom. This is so lame. We're just getting warmed up here. Okay. All right. I didn't upgrade. Let's just keep going until time runs out. So
yeah.
So we covered kind of the general European China relations before the arrival of the British, right? So the British is a latecomer. They would come after they have kind of muscle out the Dutch, right? Dutch muscle out the Portuguese, and the British muscle out the Dutch, and they came, basically took over Malacca, took over the present day Malaysia, that area from the Dutch, and then they moved to and then they from there they got the port, established the entry port and in Singapore, and they started to trade with China, and then the British at the same time, this around the time when they were also established, the British East India Company was establishing a series of forts in India, and they started to having they're carving out their influence in India in competing with France at the time in southern India. And when the British trade with China, the British had found a liking to a Chinese product, tea, right? So for some reason Britain just took to tea, and they have to have Chinese tea. So they were importing silk, porcelain, and all these other Chinese luxury goods, but particularly they're importing tea in large quantity. And to pay for the tea, British doesn't have much to trade for it, because the British, initially the British merchants tried to come to China to trade with British manufactured goods like woolen shirts, right? So at the time, the only port in China that's open to foreign trade is Guangzhou or Canton. Canton, aka today's Guangzhou, and Canton is in the tropics. Okay, so imaginably, the British woolen shirts don't have much market in the tropical climate, so they couldn't sell anything. And the only thing that Chinese would buy are actually the Indian manufactured clothes. So the British India Company, they were able to. The only thing they could even find market for in China is the Indian textiles. But that's not good enough for the British, because they have to pay for their import for tea. Which means they have to pay in hard currency, which is silver. That's the only thing that China would accept, because by then China's currency have already moved to a metal currency, which is silver. And so Chinese economy is huge, so it has a great demand for silver, because at that time, silver mine in China has been mined out pretty much. But with the expansion of Chinese economy means there's a constant need for additional silver supply. And as I mentioned before, Japan around that time, silver was discovered in Japan. So that's why the Portuguese were able to find their niche trade to do shuttle trade between China and Japan to trade Japanese silver for Chinese silk. And then Spanish discovered silver in the Americas. So 50% of the American silver that was mined from 1500s to 1800s ended up in China through this trade, through the Manila Galleon trade. And the British were also purchasing the Spanish silver from the Americas in order to trade with China. But in the end, the British decide, this is draining our silver reserve. So let's find alternative. And that's when they settle on drugs, selling drugs to China. So instead of paying for tea in silver. Now, opium has been known in China since antiquity, but it was always used as pharmaceutical. It was used in Chinese traditional medicine. It was not used as a recreational drug. For one thing, opium was imported. It was very expensive, and it was known that if you ingest opium in large quantity, it will kill you, because it stops your breathing, and you will die, right? So So, but around the time when the Europeans first came to East Asia, this also coincided with the Columbian exchange. The Spanish, the Portuguese that brought tobaccos to Southeast Asia, where it's been picked up by the Chinese trader there and taking the smoking habits to China. So tobacco was introduced to China during the Columbian exchange, and then Dutch. So in East Indies, Dutch discover a way. So if you, instead of ingesting opium, if you put opium in pipes and smoke it, that's not lethal. That's not lethal. It's not going to kill the smoker. And because in the process of smoking opium, a lot of it get burned off, right? So and pretty soon, like that, the kind of the opium smoking, but initially they mix opium with tobacco and smoking pipes, and smoking opium then start to spread from Dutch East Indies, from Java Islands to other Chinese diaspora communities, and eventually back on mainland China. But again, opium was still imported. It was still expensive. So initially it was only the elite. Only the elite could afford opium as kind of like a status symbol. You can get to smoke opium, like a luxury consumption. Now comes the British. So the British, by late 1700s, British already control large part of India, and India is one of the places that has it's a main growing region for opium, and because British control large part of India, they put it into an opium monopoly system, but under the British East India Company, which they mandated that the Indian farmers, which is under their jurisdiction, to pay taxes in opium, right? And then all the opium, they have to be sold to the British East India Company. So they got an opium monopoly in India, and they're forcing the Indian farmers to grow more and more opium instead of like the food crops, because opium is a moneymaker for the British. And then once they're able to achieve a mass production of opium in India, then British will ship this opium to smuggle them.
If I can add something there, I think the first big battles were in 1757, which is called the Battle of Buxar, which happened in what we see as current day Bengal region, or the greater Bengal Bihar region. Post that, the first thing the British did was to enforce production of opium and completely end the production of food crops, which led to a mass famine that killed almost 20 million people. Exactly 10 years, when this was a famine that lasted a decade. And post that, after another 10 years, there was another battle called the Battle of Plassey in the larger similar region on the Gangetic Plain. Yet post that, yet again, as the territory started expanding, the Britishers did the same thing, and it led to another famine where another estimated 10 to 20 million people died over a period of a single decade. So I think from that point on, there were sequence of mass famines. It is ironic. In fact, there are estimates from there till India became independent. There have been 32 famines in India in that period of 200 years, and each of those famines at least killed 3 to 4 million people out of starvation, and some of them are as large as 20 million. We only hear about the later famines that happened during the World War II,